Your car guy here. This morning we're going to do a little bit of winterization. We're going to change the thermostat on this 2003 Jeep Liberty. Fairly simple project. I'm going to give you the idea of what we're going to go through before we get started. The thermostat is fairly easy to change in these. It's actually located in this lower radiator hose. There's a housing back there that is tough to see in the light there. Plastic housing has two bolts that mount it, and we'll change the thermostat out. First things first though, we're going to drain the coolant. If you look down here on the driver's side, there's the petcock. That's the drain. We're going to put a pan under it. If you use a clean pan, you can reuse your coolant. If not, just be ready to put new coolant in. Once we drain the coolant, we'll simply take off the lower radiator hose, remove the housing, and change out the thermostat. Now these housings are made out of a plastic, so there are times you may have to replace the housing. We'll see once we get into this. Also, make sure when you're taking it apart, check the orientation of the thermostat. They have a little bypass hole in some of them that has to be oriented up in order to allow air past for bleeding purposes. Shouldn't be as important in this one, but it is something to be aware of as you do thermostats. If I was really going to try to just be froggy and didn't want to take things apart the right way, I could actually undo the two bolts that hold that housing in and pull it back with the hose attached and change the thermostat that way. I'm not going to do that though. Higher likelihood that you're going to miss something, maybe not get your O-ring seal back in quite right. So we're going to go ahead and take the hose off and give you a good. Once you have your pan underneath, simply open the drain valve and drain out your coolant. Once you have your drain valve open, it's helpful to make it drain a little faster, to remove the lid off of your surge tank. This allows air in, so as it's flowing out, it can drain more quickly. All right, so once we have our coolant drained, what we'll do next is we'll take off the lower radiator hose clamp nearest to the radiator. We'll make sure to put back in our plug and tighten it for the radiator drain, because what we don't want to do is get done and then put everything back in and realize we forgot to tighten that up. We'll take out this clamp from underneath the vehicle. We'll squeeze it, slide it back, take the hose off. Then we're going to take the two bolts out of the thermostat housing and take it off with this hose attached to the thermostat housing. This just makes life a little bit simpler. So what you can see I've done is I've gone underneath and I've moved that hose clamp back off of the neck of the radiator. I've moved over my drain pan now that I plugged the other side, because this lower hose can be slightly lower than the drain plug. Then I'll simply be able to work the hose and get it broke free from the radiator and slide it off. There you go. Next, I'm going to take my two bolts that have 8mm heads out, the top one, which is right there if you're looking from above, and then one directly below that. We'll get those out and we should be able to pull the entire housing and hose out. And there I am on the lower bolt for the thermostat housing, so you can get a reference. Once you have both bolts out, you should be simply able to work back and forth and remove the housing. And you'll see that your housing and our hose all came out as one piece. Now once we had the housing out, the thermostat simply dropped out, and I'm going to give you a view down in here of where it mounts. So get a nice view there. You'll notice this is the bypass bleed right here in the top of the housing, and that does need to be up when you install it, so towards the top of the engine. And now we'll simply put in our new thermostat. Okay, we have our new thermostat, and I'm going to show you how to make sure it's up. Same air bleed. It's a little bit different looking than the original thermostat. Not a big deal that they look a little different. But you'll see on the seal, there's that tab. inside the housing, there's a notch. That tab will go inside that notch when you install your thermostat, and you just install it right into this housing before you install it into the vehicle. So get it pressed in there nice and smooth. Now, when this is inside the vehicle, you'll notice that it's going to sit at about that angle, which has our bleed in the right position. That keeps it so that air can bypass and get out of the system, and we don't end up with a pocket of air locked in and trapped in the cooling system, which can cause overheat issues. So, thermostat is fully inserted into the housing. We'll simply feed everything back down into here, set it in place, and we will install our bolts and get this back together. Pretty simple job, especially by leaving the lower radiator hose attached in here. That clamp on the lower radiator hose can be a little bit of a pain to get off. It's actually easier to get off with it outside of the vehicle. With the housing back in place, we'll simply install our bolts. Now, I find it easy to go ahead and slide the lower radiator hose onto the radiator. That helps everything hold in the position it's supposed to be in and not fall or be out of place while we're putting it in. I always like to hand start the bolts as far as I can first to make sure they're not cross-threaded, because if you cross-thread them, then you got a whole bunch of extra work, or you're going to be paying a mechanic to do it, and they're going to charge you a whole bunch of extra money. So hand thread them in first before you go grabbing your ratchet and tighten them up. All right, our bolts are installed. One thing we got to make sure we don't forget is to put our lower clamp back in place on the radiator. Just remember, when you're tightening those bolts, they are small. Do not tighten them too much, you'll break them. Snug plus a tiny bit. That'd be my advice if you don't have a torque wrench. If you have a torque wrench, look up the specs. The reason I don't give them is because one of you would end up having something that's had an update or something, and you torque it to that and break it, and then you blame me. And I don't want to be blamed. I just want to have fun. So make sure we put our clamp back in place, and then we're going to refill our coolant. And before we finish, run the engine to temp. That means get it hot enough that the thermostat opens and cycles. We may have some air pockets as it does that. We'll have to continually add a little bit more coolant to it. But we want to make sure that we run it fully to temp. Thermostat cycles, opens when it's supposed to, which is around 196 degrees, and we'll be in good shape. Reason why we changed the thermostat. Well, in this case, this one's sticking a little bit, but this is a good idea, and honestly, it's one of the most overlooked pieces of maintenance. It should be changed really every 2 years at the most. It's just a wear item. Keep from overheating your engine by changing it when you should, and avoid a overheat where you crack a head or ruin the engine. So cheap little piece. Thermostat itself, you're talking 20 some bucks, and you're going to save yourself from damaging your engine. But you'll also make sure too, if this thing's stuck open, you don't get enough heat. Wintertime, you're going to want heat. If it's stuck closed, the engine's going to overheat. You blow up your motor. You're on the side of the road in the freezing cold, by the way, and you'll be unhappy. So please make sure to change your thermostat regularly. This is your car guy. Please like, share, and subscribe. And if you have questions, send me a message. I try to respond to all the messages that I can, and give you as much advice as I can.